Past 3 days, I, along with Diane Popoff, served as your delegates to the Sierra Pacific Synod's annual assembly. We were accompanied there by our spouses, Marcia and Steve. In one sense, assemblies can be quite boring because there are endless hours of sitting and listening to reports from dignitaries and committees, interspersed with voting on the business of the church, broken up with an occasional hymn or prayer, and all of that being surrounded by 2 worship services, 2 Bible studies, and 2 keynote addresses. The one thing that I can surely report to you with absolute confidence is that the posterior was challenged, almost to the point of endurance. And if you want verification of that, ask my fellow attendees. But in spite of that, through it all, there begins to emerge a picture of the people of God at work. At work in our congregations, at work in our communities, and at work around the world. And it is a beautiful image, an image that is truly life-transforming. That came home to me most clearly in a report that came from our campus ministries, which you and I support through that portion of our offerings which we send on to the Synod. In that report from Campus Ministries, we heard from a Native American student attending Stanford University who arrived on the campus as a freshman, very much alone and very scared. And during her first year there, she was so miserable and so lonely and felt like she didn't belong that she was ready to drop out, to leave Stanford, and to return home. That image of E.T. saying, home. Remember the picture? E.T. go home. And it was that kind of passion and pathos that she spoke with. And she talked about home and her discomfort on the campus. But she happened to attend a meeting of the campus ministry where they shared a meal and they sang a hymn. Sounds sort of ordinary, doesn't it? Sort of mundane, like no big deal. But you never know. Because it was life-transforming for her. Because the hymn that they happened to sing was a hymn that she had sung many times in her faith community at home. And suddenly she was no longer alone. Suddenly she no longer felt like a stranger. Now she mattered. Now she belonged. You may not think that your gifts matter, but for this one student, it was literally the gift of life. She remained at Stanford and is now a senior. Her life enriched and empowered through campus ministry, and she now stands ready to go out into our world and to serve. And that's just one story. We also heard how our ministry to and with our sister Synod of Rwanda has produced much fruit for them and for us. We saw pictures of the high school that we helped to build and the student body that you enabled to continue their education, who will, upon graduation, help to continue to transform that country from the ashes of its genocidal war. And we saw pictures of the churches that you helped build, both the buildings and the congregations that you helped nourish, and who in turn help nourish us with their valuable lesson and message of reconciliation that they have learned through the depths of hell. And they can now share with us on how to return to God. That's another story. And the stories continued throughout the weekend. The assembly was organized around the theme, always being made new, which is about the power of God at work in us and through us, through the amazing gifts of the Holy Spirit let loose in our lives. Being made new is reflected in the Synod's new mission statement, which you have in your bulletins. This is a rather long mission statement, but it's summarized in the upper right-hand corner of your insert with a easy-to-remember statement. Sierra Pacific Synod, committed to being reformed. And the hyphen is essential for reading the mission statement correctly. Not only are we formed as God's people, but we are constantly being reformed, reshaped, renewed. All things being made new, always. Now this statement, and I'd like you to hang on to this. I'd like you to take it home and keep it in a prominent place and use it for your daily reflection and devotions. Become familiar with it, because we will return to this mission statement several times in the coming months. But this is not about them. It's about us. We, this congregation, along with 186 other congregations, divided into 17 conferences and 5 voting districts, we are the Sierra Pacific Synod of the ELCA. This is not their mission statement. This is a mission statement about us, about our ministry. As I registered for the assembly, I was handed an envelope with our record for our congregation's benevolence for the first quarter of 2013. And then once we gathered at our tables for the first business session, one of the very first documents that were passed out for the assembly was a list of congregation mission support and designated gifts from our last fiscal year. All 187 congregations listed in conference with what they gave to Synod. The assembly last year gave $1,292. Now, on the surface, as an assembly, that was boring, folks. Just more sitting on your keister and looking at paper, business as usual. But behind those boring actions, one begins to see how those gifts were used. How those dollars were translated into the fulfillment of Jesus' command that we love one another. And as they spoke repeatedly throughout the assembly of how we love one another, they did so by using a catchphrase that was repeated, I think, by every major speaker at the assembly, that we, that is, this gathered community of saints, we are writing the next chapter of Acts. Think about that. Think about how following the arrest of Jesus and his execution, the disciples abandon him and go into hiding in Jerusalem, fearing for their own lives, imagining that Rome or the temple authorities would be only too happy to prosecute them as well. And so they remain huddled together behind locked doors, gathered in fear. But then some strange things begin to happen. And they experience some encounters with the crucified and now risen Jesus. And as he meets with them, he breathes on them and gives them the gift of the Spirit. And ever so slowly, as the implications of the resurrection of Jesus begins to sink in, they are transformed into being a courageous band of followers who risk life and limb in order to continue the ministry that he had taught them about and demonstrated for them and invited them into. And they began to turn the world upside down. The book of Acts reports on what happens as a result of God's Spirit being set loose among these 12 out in the world. Quickly summing it up, we can say this is what happens. Missions continue. The blind see, the lame walk, the poor have good news preached to them. The leaven that was hidden in the loaf is at work, transforming the world. And the darkness of the world, which was all around them, the darkness of the world begins to give way to the light of Christ.